Professor Quine, I want to ask you about your attitude towards behaviorism. In your recent book, Pursuit of Truth, you say, and I quote, "In psychology, one may or may not be a behaviorist, but in linguistics, one has no choice." Is this the attitude towards behaviorism you have always had since the beginning of your philosophical career, or is this something you have come to lately? And could you explain why you distinguish between linguistics and psychology in this way?
What I had in mind here was not a permissiveness outside linguistics, but rather merely the irrelevance. That is to say, others, unlike me, might depart from behaviorism in their psychology, but even they can't coherently do so on the linguistic side, because language is learned by observation of one another's behavior and acquired that way only. So that was it. It wasn't that I was wavering in my own behaviorism, although I think early and late my behaviorism has been pretty sketchy.
Pretty theoretically, it would seem that language is a phenomenon that involves not simply observable behavior, but having thoughts and putting those thoughts into words. I mean, it involves some things that are going on inside our heads, not merely the observable manifestations of those things that are going on inside our heads. So to characterize language and meaning as behavioral phenomena, does this involve an element of stipulation on your part?
Well, I think here again we have here we have a nice example of functionalism. That certainly there's an awful lot of internal activity that underlines linguistic behavior, and but when we're dealing simply with the linguistic phenomenon, with the phenomenon of communication and acquisition of language, we're abstracting from the internal, to go back to my analogy of the trimmed bushes, abstracting from the internal structure, twigs and all within the bush, and scrutinizing only the external form. And it's the external form that's the business of linguistics, not of the entire science of language, which would include all the causation, evolution, and the rest, but linguistics, the semantics, syntax, lexicon.
I wonder if I can take you back about 20 years to your paper about linguistics. I'm thinking of Methodological Reflections on Current Linguistic Theory. That paper was certainly perceived as laying down a very serious challenge to Chomskyan linguistics. Roughly what you did there was to cast doubt upon the idea of a tacitly known theory by raising the question, what empirical sense could be made of the distinction between two tacitly known theories, two grammars, in the case where, as you said, they were extensionally equivalent, which we can just take to mean they license all the same strings as being grammatical.
Good.
Now, one response that could be made internal to the science is that actually this notion of extensional equivalence doesn't play any role in the science, so the question might seem to pass the science by, but still, taking the question just in its own terms, do you still think that there's a problem of making empirical sense of the distinction between extensionally equivalent theories?
No, not in that extreme form. The thesis that you've described, in fact, even dates back a good deal farther to, I guess it was 1952, a lecture I gave in Michigan, which then appeared in the middle of that little volume, From a Logical Point of View, in 1953. where I was claiming that there conceivably many ways that a grammar could be codified in terms of parts of what count as parts of speech, how many declensions and so on, still describe the same output, so that one's objective in compiling a grammar of a language would be a mere simplicity with that output of what constitute strings belonging to the language. And I felt that still in the paper that you're referring to, which was somewhat later. But then it was a paper by Morris Halle, who made me see that there is something more that can be said there in the way of discriminating between grammars that give the same output and discriminating in a strictly behavioral way, namely by observing the history of the child's successive mistakes and corrections in his acquisition of the language. We get a chronological order there, and Halle's suggestion was set up your grammatical rules in such a way as to mimic that order of acquisition of the rules by the child as reflected in the child's history of error and correction. So this is good. And one could still say, well, there could be two purposes for a grammar, and it'd be more illuminating scientifically to set up a grammar in the light of Halle's suggestion. But for other purposes, pedagogical purposes, departing from that but giving the same strings as output would be, if it happened to be a lot simpler, would be better for pedagogical purposes generally, where the whole purpose is just acquisition of the language. Yes, although I think there's I think it's very, very likely that following Halle's line would give you as simple ultimate grammar anyway as you would hope to get, if only because of the shortcuts of natural selection in the development of the language itself, so to speak. Of course, the fact remains, in principle, even taking into consideration Halle's restriction, that different systematizations, but not as different, but still mutually different, would give the same output in this sense of in respect to this richer set of demands on the resulting grammar, getting it diachronic with respect to the individual's learning process, as well as synchronic.
Can I just ask whether there's any particular privilege which attaches to developmental or acquisition data, once we start admitting further sources of behavioral data to choose between grammars? The other kind of data which springs to mind is the data from the decay of language. So after brain injury, people have all sorts of quite interesting patterns of decay of their language, and we could look at what sorts of capacities decay together, what sorts of capacities decay independently of each other, which sorts of things can be impaired while other abilities remain intact. Would this kind of evidence also be, at least potentially, relevant to the choice between grammars?
Yes, I think equally. That would be very good. I remember Roman Jakobsen years ago steering me to work on amnesia by a brain physiologist. I think his name was Kurt Goldstein, where he was going into these linguistic consequences, and yes, that would be worth taking into consideration as well.
Can I just ask for something about the status of this evidence and what you would think it was actually achieving? One gloss on what you've said would be that it might be interestingly elegant to try to match something about the structure of the grammar to something about the structure of the time course of development. That wouldn't be the way this evidence is construed in the science, where the evidence is taken to be just part of normal scientific realism. We want to know what the psychological state in the person's head really is, and this evidence is evidence about how that is. So would you be willing to say now that the suggestion that such and such a grammar is the grammar that the child is really acquiring, this is a perfectly normal, scientific, realistic claim?
Yes, provided that we don't cut it any finer than the restrictions imposed by considerations of development and decay. We would say that any of the possible structural deviations within those limits qualified equally as the child, as the grammar that the child had learned.